Good blessed this Saturday morning, August the 31st, 2024, the time being 8:08 a.m. I greet all human beings all around the world with the universal greetings of peace and the blessings of God be with you. It doesn't matter what your political, philosophical, personal, nor your religious beliefs may be. Doesn't matter whether you the richest to the poorest person on the face of this earth. It doesn't even matter whether you the proclaimed toughest to the proclaimed weakest person on the face of this earth. Doesn't matter if you're my family, friends, nor my proclaimed enemies. Doesn't matter whether you like me, nor anything that I say or do. That's your prerogative. You have a First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Freedom of press, freedom of speech, freedom to protest, freedom to gather, freedom to associate. If you're a felon or you're on probation or parole, check with your local law enforcement officials to see whether or not that you can gather together as being with other felons or if you're on probation or parole. But what I want to talk about real briefly, because I want y'all to watch some YouTube videos going back to 2016 and 2017 when a young black individual, brother from Nashville, Tennessee, I think he was about 28 years old at the time. All right now. Named Tory, that's Toryd Sanders. He was driving and he happened to stumble into the state of Missouri, Charleston, Missouri, and stopped at a truck stop to get gas. And the people called the police, and he let the police know that he was suffering from some crisis, some mental crisis, and he wanted help. The Charleston, Missouri Police Department should have been trained, but if you know who they chief and commander or director of police is, Robert Hearns, you will see why they probably did what they did. Instead of getting this man some mental help by calling an ambulance, because he hadn't committed a crime, and take him to a local hospital, Sykes in Missouri was the closest, about 15 miles south of here. They took him to the Charleston, Missouri, Mississippi County Detention Center, where that was his last time being alive. About 4 or 5 Charleston, Missouri police officers, along with 4 or 5 Mississippi County Sheriff deputies, along with the then sheriff, went in there, and you'll hear the story. They actually murdered him. Some of them is still on the force here, and some of them is still on the force in other places. Nobody was never charged with the murder. But I want y'all to listen to the story. You see, when you hear NAACP, they ain't talking about the NAACP here in Charleston, Missouri. They ain't even talking about none in Southeast Missouri, the Boot Heel. You'll get the Ku Klux Klan to help you in the Boot Heel before you get some type of leaders in Southeast Missouri to do any help. But they talk about me, but you will see back in 2016, in this 2024 now, I was speaking up then. I met Toryd Sanders' mother, brought him down here, took him to Arthur Cassell to his church, Mercy Seat Church, Baptist Church, and Arthur Cassell question to his Toryd Sanders' mother, who the individual was murdered in the jail, asked her how much money she is looking for. He asked me the same thing when I was suing Black Gold Farms for calling blacks the N-word and having KKK. He asked me how much money I'm trying to get. I didn't use him. She didn't use him. She used the NAACP out of Nashville, Tennessee, and one NAACP member in his chapter, Nimrod Chapel, he came down. He spoke up, and you'll hear him speaking up. He came down when Tyrone Anderson was found murdered in the jail, the same jail a few years ago. The NAACP here, they didn't do nothing. None of them. Rodney Jones was the NAACP president when Tyrone Anderson was found dead in there. Arthur Cassell was the president when Toryd Sanders was in there. None of them did no marching, but they talk about me. I want y'all to know something else. Google up and see what ratio is blacks here in Charleston, Missouri, Mississippi County versus white. 58% blacks, and you don't have no black prosecuting attorneys, nobody blacks in the prosecuting attorney, no black judges. no black public defenders, one black police officer that been on the force for about 30 years, no black sheriff deputies. City Hall is full of all whites with the exception of the black police that been on there for 30-something years. But I want y'all to pay close attention. The NAACP out of Jefferson City, Nimrod Chapel, he got a travel advisory going because of the murders of blacks in Charleston, Missouri. Not the NAACP here, but I want y'all to just pay close attention. A.M. in the morning. This YouTube video is dedicated to Tory D. Sanders out of Nashville, Tennessee, a 28-year-old black man who lost his life on May the 5th, 2017, just last Friday. He died in the Mississippi County Detention Center, or jail, here in Charleston, Missouri. An autopsy was done, and they said it was inconclusive. The sheriff of the detention center said that Tory D. Sanders got into an altercation with 5 of his deputies or staff. Somehow he ended up collapsing, going to the hospital 15 miles away from here, Sykeston, Missouri, and he was pronounced dead. I'm letting the family know that me and my household, we stand with you. We live in this town of 5,947 people. It's one of the most racist and unjust towns or cities that I ever lived in the 59 years of my life. Now, don't get me wrong. All white people are not racist, but the ones who's running this town, there's no question or doubt that they are racist. They put the black, educated blacks on their payrolls. NAACP president, been the president here for 22 years, haven't stood up for no civil rights actions. They have a unified coalition against violence here in Charleston, Missouri that was formed October of 2016. They marched at one time on the west side of Charleston, Missouri, which was April the 30th, 2017. They never marched again. They marched because some of the people that was in their march had me locked up. I'm an activist. Had me locked up on the 18th of April of 2016 for videoing one of them for lying to children. They have a history of covering up. Have another autopsy done by somebody independent. God is already working because of the United States Department of Justice. The United States Attorney General has taken over the investigation. They familiar with what's going on here. The judges, most of them in the 33rd Circuit in Mississippi County in Charleston, Missouri, they're corrupted. I've been in front of them. I had to have the Supreme Court Justice out of Jefferson City, the capital in the state of Missouri, to appoint another judge from the 32nd Circuit out of Cape Girardeau, Missouri, to handle a case of mine that I was going up against some of the sellout blacks and the whites that put them up to trying to get me banned from a public place. The judge threw it out. The same judge that heard mine that came from Cape Girardeau, Missouri, he's hearing the case of the sheriff who has 18 counts that the Attorney General put on him on criminal cases. But I'm telling you now, keep praying. Don't trust the NAACP here in Charleston, Missouri. Don't trust none of these preachers. Don't trust none of these so-called civil rights leaders, because they don't do nothing but try to put individuals like me that's exposing corruption in the legal system, whether they black or white. They trying to get me locked up. They don't want to hear my voice. But I'm making this YouTube and I'm dedicating it to justice for Tory D. Sanders. I'm asking all true, real, God-fearing activists in all human beings, no matter what your nationality is.
Death of Tory Sanders in the Mississippi County Jail May 5th. That death shocked Mr. Sanders' family. Now the NAACP is stepping in to find answers. Sheree Honeycutt joins us now live from Charleston with that part of the story. Sheree?
Kathy, Sanders' family says they want justice after his death here at the Mississippi County Detention Center. Now, the details are still unclear, but we do know that at the time of Sanders' death, he was being held, not under arrest. And the incident that led to Sanders' death injured 6 officers, as you mentioned. The lawyer for the NAACP says if Sanders was only detained, he may have been dealing with a mental health issue.
If someone is having a mental health crisis, you do not detain them, restrain them, and tase them.
According to the Mississippi County coroner and the active sheriff Terry Parker, Sanders' cause of death is undetermined. Now, I tried to speak to the Charleston Department of Public Safety and the Mississippi County Sheriff's Department about this today. They referred me back to the Attorney General's office.
3 years ago, a Tennessee man took a wrong turn and ended up in Missouri. He got lost and went to the police for help, and within 7 hours, he was dead, the subject of a dog pile in a jail cell in Mississippi County. That's in Missouri's Boot Heel, about 40 miles south of Cape Girardeau. Jail officials pressed down on his neck for 3 minutes. They didn't stop, even as their colleagues urged them to ease up. They didn't stop until he passed out. And Tory Sanders died not long after. He was 28 years old. At the time, one of the only journalists to pay much attention to his death was Doyle Murphy. He was then a staff writer at the Riverfront Times. He's now the editor-in-chief of the paper. And in a May 2017 cover story, Doyle detailed how Tory Sanders had sought help from law enforcement, only to wind up dead at their hands.
I talked to Tory's mother and aunt after he died. And I remember them talking about him just kind of looking around for help after he'd run out of gas and lost his way. And I think his mother told him, he was asking her, will the police help me if I go ask police to help me find my way? And she said, yeah, sure. Yeah, the police will help you, figuring that they would at least point him to a bus stop or something. And it turned out to be, through no fault of hers, just such a terrible turn. I think he really, they still believed that the police would help him. And I think in a lot of places that if he didn't landed in a different town, they might have. But it's just such a series of little small decisions through the way that turned so tragic for him. Any one of these, it could have gone a different way and Tory would still be alive.
That's Doyle Murphy of the Riverfront Times. The case was shocking to Doyle, and in full disclosure, it was also shocking to me. I was then Doyle's editor at the Riverfront Times, and I think it's fair to say that Tory Sanders' death haunted both of us. But while Doyle stayed on the story, and the state chapter of the NAACP did its best to push for answers, bigger news outlets never really followed. No one was ever charged in Sanders' death, and the story faded from the headlines.
That area of Missouri is kind of a vacuum. It's down in the Boot Heel. There's some small papers there. There's a TV station or two that cover parts of it, but there's not really the wider focus on it. Even after we wrote about this, I reached out to some people at the places that I thought might be interested in looking at this too, because I just thought a broader media spotlight would maybe turn up some more information or help make some changes there. But I think it was just kind of too far off the beaten path for everyone. And that was before, people were really looking at, oh, here's a case where somebody really pushed down on this guy's neck, or where they put a knee on his neck, and, that he was struggling in these times that, in a way that's so kind of eerily similar to what happened to George Floyd. But I think at the time, nobody was really paying attention.
And that, again, is Doyle Murphy of the Riverfront Times. Now, the eerie similarities that Doyle describes there, that they now have the NAACP and some state lawmakers calling for fresh eyes to take a look at Tory Sanders' death. And joining me today to talk about this new push for action is Nimrod Chappell, Jr. He is the president of the Missouri NAACP. Nimrod, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for having me.
When did you first realize the similarities between George Floyd's death and this 3-year-old case here in Missouri?
Well, instantly, to be honest, because they are so similar. You know, Floyd and Sanders both died with law enforcement's knee literally on their neck. The only difference was Floyd was in the middle of the street and Mr. Sanders was in a jail cell.
And this thing about the jail cell, I feel like sometimes when people hear a man died in jail, they assume, oh, you know, he's been convicted of a crime. He deserves to be in jail. That was not at all the case with this guy. He just got lost. What do we know about Tory Sanders' life before he ended up making this wrong turn into Missouri?
Well, sure. Tory Sanders was a 28-year-old man, lived in Tennessee, was married, had a number of children, loved by his family, and had gone out for a drive that night, ostensibly to clear his head. Runs out of gas that night, and his life was forever changed by his interaction with law enforcement at that time.
And we know from the reporting Doyle's done on this and from the lawsuit and you know, calls to the family, we know that he sought out law enforcement because he wanted some help. Do we have any idea of why the Mississippi County Sheriff's Department ended up turning on him so fiercely?
No, and they actually interacted with him twice. The first time at a gas station, apparently, you know, they talked to each other. They understood that he was trying to get some money to get some gas, and they left him there. The second time, they say that he was acting weird, and so they took him into protective custody. Now, you know, protective custody is a lot different than being arrested for a crime or even thought that you committed a crime. They wanted to make sure that he was okay. And so they called a mental health professional from one of the local agencies who I think within 12 or 16 minutes determined that he was fine.
So they determined that he's fine, and this protective custody, this was supposed to be protecting him from himself, is the idea.
Yes, that's exactly right.
And yet things in the next couple hours ended up going so awry. I mean, some of these details are so horrible. And my understanding is many of these interactions are captured in surveillance in this jail where we see them aiming tasers at him, blasting him with pepper spray through sort of a hole in the cell. Just repeated interactions, even before this dog pile, that led to them choking him out. Have you heard any justification on their part for these series of actions?
No, and so at one point they have said in the civil litigation that they thought that there was a plate that was broken, that they fed him a plate at noontime, and they thought that was a broken plate, but there's no broken plate. I mean, there's no report of a broken plate. And if you can imagine those thick plastic trays that you have in an institution like a jail, they are not breakable. Right? And so that's just something that they made up. What many suspect is that Mr. Sanders was in the jail cell, that he had met with the mental health professional earlier in the day, that he got there about 10 a.m., about 10:14 actually, and he meets with the mental health guy about noon, and the mental health guy leaves at 12:20, says he's fine, take him out of there. Well, hours later, Mr. Floyd's asking questions. You can, I understand, you can see the jailers coming by and, throwing up their hands or nodding their head or even sometimes pointing their finger at him. I think he was making noise saying, "I want to get out of here."
It's such a mystifying case. And I have to say, I mean, there's so much attention being paid to issues of police brutality, particularly involving black men right now. Do you think race played a role in what happened to Tory Sanders?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, number one, this particular jail in Mississippi County has a long history of people being brutalized in the jail. There are a number of deaths that relate to people who were being held there, and I have no doubt that when they went into that cell, that they were going to do two things. One, they were going to demonstrate to Mr. Sanders who was in charge, that he could not make noise and that they would do what they wanted to with him. And then the other thing is that they went in. Why? Imagine a jail cell in Little Mississippi County. This is not like some palatial cell. This isn't meant for 12 people. This isn't a pod. It's a little bitty place. It might as well be a phone booth. But they packed 10 sheriff's deputies and police officers in there with him in that little bitty cell. You know, there is a perception, and I think that some of the jailers actually said this, that, you know, Mr. Sanders was throwing us around. That's just ridiculous. He was a 28-year-old medium-build black guy. That's it. He was not a bodybuilder. He was not a martial arts expert. He wasn't special forces. This isn't some black Rambo. This is a young man who simply wanted to go home. And their perception of him led them to the actions that ultimately brought him to death.
We're talking to Nimrod Chappell Jr., the president of the Missouri NAACP, about a troubling death from 2017 in Mississippi County, Missouri. And Nimrod, a really interesting part of this story is the role of the Mississippi County Sheriff. This is a guy named Corey Hutchinson. He'd been elected in 2016 in that same election that brought President Trump into office. He was a Republican who toppled the longtime sheriff, a Democrat. And Sheriff Hutchinson vowed to clean up this Boot Heel community. In just a few months of being in office, he wound up facing criminal charges, among them allegations he'd illegally surveilled his opponents. He was actually under indictment for those charges when he led the charge into Sanders' jail cell, these 9 officers that rushed in. And am I right in recalling this? Hutchinson is one of the people that is accused of pressing down on Sanders' neck in that final fatal part of this dog pile.
Well, absolutely, absolutely. And straight out of the petition that they filed in the civil case. And unfortunately, that's where a lot of the facts reside, simply because this case has never been tried. No one's been indicted. There's been no record made of the criminal actions that were done against Mr. Sanders. But the statement that came out of there from Mr. Hutchinson is that one of his coworkers, this is another officer in that little bitty cell, is trying to determine whether he can get a pulse on Mr. Sanders because he's unresponsive as he's cuffed there. And Hutchinson tells him, "No, I'm good," and refuses to move his knee.
I mean, some of these details, they are just horrifying. And again, this guy is already, the guy who refused to move his knee, he was already under criminal indictment at the time. So Attorney General Josh Hawley did open an investigation into this death. Were you thinking that he might charge Sheriff Hutchinson for his role in Sanders' death?
Well, and this is what was really troubling to me. Yes. At the time, this is, as you can imagine, the NAACP was way up in arms. You know, this is a death in a jail where the person wasn't even in custody. I mean, they were protective custody, but they weren't under arrest, and it was unexplained. Governor Greitens at the time promised that there was going to be transparency, that we would get a full copy of the investigation that was being conducted by the Highway Patrol, and we got the same promise out of Hawley's office. But the interesting thing was that we got a promise of justice, as did the family, and then ultimately just dropped it like it was a hot potato with no explanation. We never got a piece of paper regarding the investigation, and that's we, the NAACP. I can understand if just a person was asking a question and they didn't feel like they had to respond to that. But we had been in communication with the family, and of course the community down there in Charleston was very concerned with law enforcement run amok, killing people inside the institution, and I should say killing more people. You would have thought that any time that you've got 4 people that have died in a row at that same institution, that somebody would be looking into it. But no, the Attorney General Hawley at the time did not prosecute.
And in this death, Hawley ended up blaming something called excited delirium. Now, that's an explanation that law enforcement sometimes uses in cases that involve tasers, which, of course, were involved here. But it's worth noting this is not recognized as an actual condition by the American Medical Association, the American Psychological Association, or the World Health Organization. And so this is something that Doyle Murphy reported on. Here are some more of his thoughts.
Corey Hutchinson did not end up getting charged with anything in Sanders' death. He did go to federal prison for a little while for illegally tapping into or illegally tracing people's cell phones. But nobody's ever been charged in Tory's death. There's a couple lawsuits pending, but these many years later, his family is still trying to figure out what happened and trying to find some kind of resolution or some kind of justice out of it.
And again, that's Doyle Murphy of the Riverfront Times. Now, Hawley's office, he's now a U.S. Senator. They reached out to me unsolicited yesterday when they heard we were doing this show. They seem to want to defend Hawley's work on this. His spokeswoman gave us a statement that says, as Attorney General, Senator Hawley went to court to have the sheriff removed from office, stripped of his badge, charged with state and federal crimes, and sent to prison. Senator Hawley supports any further prosecutorial action the evidence will support. And obviously, when Hawley's talking about those charges, they're talking about the charges for surveilling opponents. Those were already on the books at the time that this death happened. Nimrod Chappell, do you think Hawley did everything he could in this case?
No, and here's why. The prosecutor down there, Mr. Cann, C-A-N-N, who's a local county prosecutor and has been since he was appointed by Governor Holden, recognized that he had a conflict of interest and refused to be a part of the prosecution. So he turned it over to the Attorney General's office. Someone has got to seek justice in this case. And if it's not the Attorney General, then it's got to be the feds. But to say that, he was forceful in requesting a prosecution for pinging some highway patrolman's phones, that's great. That's a part of the justice system. That's good. But what about the murder? Where's that been prosecuted at?
I mean, I think that's a huge question. And you are now pressing Hawley's successor. This is now current Attorney General Eric Schmitt to take this on. What would you like to see Eric Schmitt do with this case?
I would like to see Eric Schmitt reopen the investigation and follow through with prosecution. And if he doesn't want to do that, I would like him to take the investigation that's already been concluded by the Highway Patrol for the state of Missouri in conjunction with the Federal Bureau of Investigation and turn it over to federal authorities and request that the U.S. attorneys prosecute Corey Hutchison for the death and the murder of Tory Sanders, along with the officers that were in the cell at the same time.
Now, you've won support on this call to action from Missouri's Legislative Black Caucus. Do you think they're going to help you in pushing this issue?
Yes, I do. Senator Carla May has long been an advocate for civil rights, and particularly for the rule of law, as has Stephen Roberts, who's the chair of the Legislative Black Caucus. Both of those individuals, and that body in particular, understand that we as Americans, if we had one unifying theme, it's that the laws have to be applied equally to everyone. And so in particular in these cases where Mr. Floyd was murdered and here where Mr. Sanders was murdered, people are demanding that murder charges be brought against those who are accountable.
So we got an email from our listener, Rachel, who lives in Fenton. And Rachel writes, this news story has excessive use of force and possible murder charges written all over it. I definitely urge Eric Schmitt to reopen the case and to investigate all officers involved. I never even heard of this case before. Was there an autopsy done? Is Josh Hawley saying he died of excited delirium? I never even heard of this condition. I will call Eric Schmitt's office and urge him to reopen the case. If members of the public are feeling called to do something on this, Nimrod, what would be the best way that they could help you put the pressure on as far as this case goes?
Well, Sarah, and that's exactly the right thing. Right now, we have talked with Eric Schmitt, and he has told us that he is going to make a determination. That was at the end of last week that I had that conversation with him, and he promised further meetings with the NAACP and other organizations to make sure that we can bring justice. But I think that what we need to do now is make sure that the Attorney General understands that the people of Missouri want justice to be had. In this case, just as we had demanded justice with thousands, tens of thousands of us in the street over the last few weeks demanding justice for Mr. Floyd, who is many states away. We want justice right here at home. And so a call to Eric Schmitt asking that he demand justice and pursue a prosecution of Corey Hutchison and the other people involved in the murder of Tory Sanders would be in order.
Nimrod, so many black men have been killed since this particular death. This was in May of 2017. And frankly, many of them have been at the hands of law enforcement. What keeps this particular case at the top of your agenda?
No one's ever been charged. And the Boot Hill has a long history of lynchings, which I think are closely related to law enforcement's perception of African Americans and black folks there and around that area. Here we have a person who was just driving on the road and ran out of gas. Well, you know, the NAACP has been complaining for the last 20 years that we've been collecting data about the vehicle stops report, in essence, a determination on how many people who are black are being stopped and why that's out of proportion when compared to Caucasian brothers and sisters. And we're almost at 100%. So if we can't drive on the roads and be safe, if we can't look towards law enforcement, peace officers as they're often known as, to make sure that things are going well on some of our worst days, and that's ostensibly what they said they were going to do for Tory Sanders. But they did the exact opposite. You know, while they had communications amongst each other telling each other, let him go, get him out of there, he ends up dead. You know, the idea that the chief law enforcement of the county would murder a person in the cell, telling someone that he is good, leaving his knee on his neck while the person is cuffed after he has been beaten and tased and pepper sprayed so much that the officers had to leave the jail because they couldn't breathe and were coughing. Okay? Tory Sanders was tortured. When you get right down to it, he was tortured. And they thought that they could do that to him simply because he was a young man, because he was a black man, because he had nobody there. They had medical experts that came and they evaluated him, and they decided that despite that advice that he was free to leave, that they ought to do something to make sure that he could put a little gas in his...
Now that y'all seen all of that, here it is. You even have the news, the River, the newspaper out of St. Louis saying that the local newspapers in the local news, KFVS 12, and the local newspapers here in Charleston, Missouri, Mississippi County, or in the Boot Hill, they won't even report stuff like this here. You know why they won't report it? Because they stand on white supremacists here and house Negroes like Lester Gillespie, Rodney Jones, and a lot of these other black preachers. Lester Gillespie, he asked me, why am I speaking up for Tory D. Sanders when his mother got a settlement from the city of Charleston, Missouri, because of the death of the police taking part in the death of Tory D. Sanders, got $500,000 and got a settlement from the county, Charleston, Missouri, Mississippi County. I said, I don't care what type of settlement she got. And whether she told me or not, I was doing it for the death of her son. And not only that, to prevent other deaths, but it's been more deaths here in Charleston, Missouri. Charleston, Missouri, Mississippi County is one of the most racist, got the most racist white rulers, if the shoe fit, wear it, and got the most sellout blacks that I ever seen in my life. They generation, they families is going down as generations of sellouts. I thank God that my daddy and my mama, when my daddy got out of World War II, he went to Chicago, Illinois, and raised all 9 of us so I can be able to be prepared down here with these sellout Negroes and these racist-ass white folks. If the shoe fit, wear it. If you ain't racist, don't let it bother you. But if you is, I'm talking to you. And if you is black and a sellout, I'm talking to you and your whole family. Don't like it? Don't look at it. County Sheriff. No, that's the Charleston Police Department. I'm hoping, let's see what's going on. Which way are they going here? Going over the bridge. So it must be something happening on the I-57 northbound. They didn't go over the viaduct, which is Boomland. Let me ride my bike down and check it out. It's my type of work, y'all. Saving lives.